Welcome to the Business Extra. I'm Mustafa Al Rawi, the National's Assistant Editor-in-Chief. Today we're going to be talking about energy markets and oil and what's next. But before we do that, if you like this show, please do subscribe, or if you're on YouTube, hit that bell. Talking about energy and oil, I'm very pleased to say joining us is the National's regular contributor and also the CEO of Kamar Energy, Robin Mills. Robin, hi.
Hello, everyone.
Good to have you with us. Obviously, you're a regular contributor for us. Our audiences know you well, both from the nationalnews.com and as well as the Business Extra. It's been an interesting period for the last couple of weeks for energy markets. There's been a lot of noise around politics, particularly the US, a little bit off color because of OPEC's move to reduce output from November. But it also seems to be a bit of concern over the outlook for demand. And that seems to be the main driver for OPEC. But from your point of view, Robin, what are you seeing as the main factors at the moment dominating the discussions around energy and crude oil?
Well, absolutely, Mustafa. So what is dominating the discussions is a bit different from what's dominating the market. So, if we look back into June, oil prices were at $124 per barrel. And then subsequently, they slipped down to $84 per barrel just before the OPEC meeting, bounced back a bit and have been volatile since, but hovering around 90. So we have all this discussion about the OPEC move. We have all the discussion, of course, about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and sanctions on Russia and so on. And yet the market has been primarily responding to the demand story, and that's something that's got rather less attention. And the demand story is obviously an important one. The global economy, concerns that the global economy is showing signs of weakening. It's a bit hard to see that actually showing up in demand data yet, but there's plenty of negative indicators, but particularly around China, of course. The slowing Chinese economy, a very significant slowdown, and then the ongoing lockdowns, and it seems that China is still sticking with its very strict zero COVID policy, and that means more lockdowns and lower oil demand from China going forward. And that has been outweighing a lot of the other political action, which of course is more affecting the supply side.
Yes, because you talk about China, which has been sort of a moving target, because there were times when we thought this year that the Chinese economy post-COVID was back on track. But, particularly with President Xi, he's just got a new term, and he made it clear that the zero COVID policy was here to stay. And so we should expect that there will be continuing disruptions there. China, one of the biggest consumers of crude and gas and energy in the world. So that becomes a significant factor. But we also have the ongoing issue of the Ukraine conflict, which since the end of February has also dominated discussions. And I wonder what factors, when it comes to how Europe's energy supply is dealing with that, or how prices have been rising as a result in general with high inflation elsewhere. Does Ukraine continue to be a major factor when we look ahead?
Well, absolutely, I think it does, but in different ways depending on oil and gas, right? So, so far this crisis has been primarily a crisis of gas and therefore of electricity, which of course a lot of it is generated from gas. And that's why we've seen these exceptionally high energy bills in Europe, and those bills will get worse over the winter. That's why we've seen these severe concerns over energy security supply, and even blackouts or shortages of gas, regardless of price in Europe. We've seen Europe sucking in LNG, liquefied natural gas supplies from the rest of the world. So countries such as Pakistan, India, Bangladesh having to go short. We've seen some European utilities under huge financial stress because they're unable to afford to buy gas to serve their customers, and having to be bailed out by governments. So that's really where the economic and the price action has been, and that's been a major factor driving up inflation. Oil prices, on the other hand, we said oil prices of now around $90 per barrel. That's not exceptional in historic terms. It's a bit higher than the long-term average, not by much. And if you remember that under President Obama in the US during his time in office, the oil price was pretty consistently at $110 per barrel or above. And that was, of course, some years ago. Take inflation off that, price would be even higher today. So the oil prices that the US is confronting today are not particularly high, and yet the political concern from Joe Biden's administration is very much on the oil price. And that's why, a major reason why they responded so angrily to the OPEC Plus production cuts OPEC Plus earlier this month announced a 2 million barrel per day cut in its targets. The US had thought that it had commitments by them not to cut production, and it responded very angrily, and really kind of putting forward, I think, two reasons, but then there's one kind of less overt reason. The first reason they were concerned about was the health of the global economy. Well, I honestly don't think that oil prices at $90 per barrel are a major drag on the global economy or a major driver of inflation. It's the gas side, as I mentioned, that's more serious. The second reason was that they felt this was supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. Russia is a member of OPEC Plus, but all the OPEC Plus countries make decisions based on their own national interests as they judge it. I don't think any of them plan to do a favour to Russia in this policy. But the third unstated reason is obviously US midterm elections coming up next month, and the price of gasoline for US drivers is always a big political concern.
I'm quite surprised at the volume of the protests coming out of Washington over the OPEC Plus decision to cut output. I understand what you're saying in terms of their concerns, whether politically over midterm elections or the state of the economy. But as many OPEC Plus producers lined up, including Saudi over the last week, to make it very clear that, as you said, the decision was very much based on economic interests. That the US itself, until very recently, was the largest exporter of crude, and certainly, or at least the largest producer of crude. And it was, had its own huge shale market as well, which, given what happened with COVID, has somewhat retrenched and hasn't necessarily come back. But you would think that it would be easier if the point was to really bring supply back, to focus domestically. How much of this is posturing to a particular audience? Because I wonder, and I guess this is the question I'm asking you, how much does this political fallout actually affect the dynamics of energy markets?
Yeah, look, I think it's a complex one, but looking at it from the US administration's point of view, they're in a bit of a vulnerable position. Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia in July. The claim was that these meetings were not really about oil. That wasn't the primary purpose of his visit. It was about oil, but it was widely interpreted that was a very key issue. I think some of the US officials thought they'd got commitments from Saudi Arabia not to cut back production. I doubt that they did, but if they thought they did, then obviously that hasn't been borne out. So it's always easy to blame a foreign nation rather than domestic policies. On the other hand, though, I don't think that there's this kind of narrative. The Biden administration feels it's vulnerable to the narrative that it's damaged US oil production, and that the US could and should be producing more of its own oil instead of going to other countries. And I don't think that's really true. Look, I think the Biden administration has a pro-climate policy, quite rightly. They have a lot of green policies. They have policies you could say are anti-fossil fuel. I don't think any of those have had really any material impact on US production. They may do over the next few years. I don't think they've had made much difference so far. I think the real issue is that oil prices from 2014 through to 2020 were very low. We had an all-time epic price crash in 2020, of course, and that's really burnt shale investors in the US who don't want to invest heavily in oil now. They'd rather just take profits from past investments. And if they do try to increase production, they run up against supply chain constraints, labor force constraints, and so on, which are not easy to solve either. But of course, the oil companies, politically are generally Republican supporting, and so not inclined to bail out the Democrats.
So we have, on the one hand, we have OPEC Plus, whose kind of main priority is stability of energy markets, and largely they've been successful at this, with the exception, as you mentioned, in 2020 with COVID. But historically, they've been able to bring together OPEC members and non-OPEC members to form that OPEC Plus supergroup and ensure that there is some kind of stability between demand, supply, and prices, changing things wherever it's needed to be. And of course, as we've discussed, President Biden's administration, the US, has a different narrative that they're talking about that very much relates to them. But these voices have kind of, become loudest now, given this discussion over the last couple of weeks. But really, the most important, perhaps, discussion that was very kind of very much a priority at the beginning of this year after COP26 in Glasgow last year, and ahead next month in Egypt of COP27, and of course in the UAE COP28, which is energy as it relates to climate action and ensuring that, medium to long term, we have the right energy mix. And of course, the Ukraine war reminded us of the need for energy security and to ensure that as we transition, that we're not kind of trying to switch one system off without having another one in place. But how concerning is it at the moment that that discussion is perhaps not front and center where it should be, given the last few weeks and months?
Yeah, look, it is a big concern, and I think there's a real disconnect here. So if you look at COP26 in Glasgow, that oil and gas companies were not welcome to attend. They were not deliberately not invited. That was 2019, of course. Very soon afterwards, it became apparent that actually the oil and gas companies have a very important role in ensuring energy security in the immediate term. And there's been a desperate scramble in Europe and in general for oil and gas supplies to fill those that have been interrupted by sanctions and other disruptions, and to meet the increased demands that have come out of the COVID period. The COP 27 in Egypt, a big theme of that is going to be an African COP, and big theme is energy access. How do you bring affordable, reliable energy to the people who don't have it? And again, I think there's a recognition that denying poorer parts of the world fossil fuels in appropriate places is a misguided policy. Their emissions are very low compared to Europe or North America, and not a material part of the climate problem, but still they're being denied access to energy. And yes, renewables are a big part of that solution, but they're far from the only part. And then, of course, COP28 in the UAE next year is being held in a major oil producer. And this is, I think, a very important opportunity to try to continue this theme of what is the role of the oil and gas industry in global climate and climate policy, but also in energy security. And what is the balanced way to use oil and gas appropriately and sensibly to support energy security while still reducing emissions. And if you look at the net zero scenarios that are proposed by the International Energy Agency and others for how do we get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is only, of course, 28 years away, not a long time in the energy business. These scenarios, they still all have substantial use of oil and particularly of gas by 2050, and the kind of decline that you would see in use. So the use does go down, but still the decline in use is slower than the natural decline in oil and gas fields. In other words, if we stop investing in oil and gas, we will run out of oil and gas supplies quicker than we run out of demand. So there is a need for ongoing investment. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the Russia-Ukraine issue, which is about how do you replace a country which is the world's largest exporter, has been the world's largest exporter of gas, and one of the world's largest exporters of oil. If that country, through war and sanctions, is not able to be an exporter at those levels anymore, how can that be replaced? Again, part of that replacement is renewables, other new energy sources, improved efficiency, but some of it has to be from increased oil and gas supplies, and we see the GCC countries being an absolutely crucial part of that.
Yeah, I'm reminded of sort of 2006, 2007, when oil prices were historically very, very high. I think we had a peak of over $140 a barrel at one point around then. And so the push for renewables into the energy mix was based on economic viability, on the need to come up with a cheaper alternative to oil at the time. And this is, of course, before the big gas boom that's really happened in the last 10 to 15 years. And then the financial crisis hit, and the pace of development of renewables slowed considerably. They were no longer fashionable. Oil prices dipped, and political concerns took to the fore. Sovereign debt crises. The markets began to speak and basically dictate everything we were doing, which has been a theme of mine at the moment this week, especially given what's happened with bond markets toppling a prime minister in the UK. But how much do the energy markets really serve us? Because right now we have to push ahead with our bigger agenda, infrastructure and projects and investment. We can't just get bogged down in what this current US administration wants, or what OPEC Plus needs over the next 6 months. We need to kind of deliver on these big visionary items. And to use an example, and it's an extreme one, but the protest by Stop the Oil the other day, where they threw soup over a Van Gogh painting and kind of said, we're doing this because no one's paying attention anymore. And you know, the UK government isn't stopping oil and gas licenses like they promised. Those voices will probably continue to get louder and more extreme, which just causes more volatility and more disruption at a time when, you know, we seem to have at least a loose agreement at COP26 in Glasgow of how to move forward. It feels like all that unity is kind of just fallen apart. And I guess to get your view on it, is that too pessimistic a view of where things are at the moment?
Well, wow, there's a lot to unpack there, stuff. That is, you know, real tricky set of areas. Look, let's take the protests first. I think my problem with the protest, it's not necessarily the means of protest. People have to have eye-catching protests, you know, if they want to get a message across, whatever their campaign is. Don't particularly have a problem with that. What I do have a problem is the direction and the timing. You know, going against oil and gas production, that's always the villain. But the real problem, you know, what problems Europe got now? It hasn't tackled oil and gas consumption fast enough. Production has gone down faster than consumption, and therefore there's a shortage and very high prices. And you know, if you're going to throw oil, or if you're going to campaign at the headquarters of BP, let's say, as they have done previously, why not campaign at the headquarters of a car manufacturer or an airline or other companies which you could say are responsible for the use of fossil fuels, you know, not just their production. So that's where I think you know, the process is misguided, and also the timing. We're talking about a timing that people are across Europe and globally, and very much in developing countries, are struggling with energy bills that are just simply unaffordable. And whether consumers pay or whether the government pays, you know, the money for this is not available indefinitely. There's a shortage of supply, and that means somebody's got to go short. And the question is just, how do you protect the vulnerable, and how do you allocate that energy in what you do have in the most sensible way? And choosing this moment to suggest that the solution is less oil and gas production, I think is counterproductive to people who are struggling to pay their bills and who are going to, you know, lose sympathy for the climate cause. And I think, look, they say there's nothing being done on climate. Actually, there's a huge amount being done on climate. We've made tremendous progress in recent years, since Paris in 2015. And you mentioned, yeah, there was a lost decade following the financial crisis of low investment, too low investment in renewables. But we're now past that. You know, renewable investment is booming. Electric vehicles are booming. We're seeing a lot of very interesting and important new technologies entering the market. Tremendous appetite for all kind of climate solutions. Carbon capture and storage is really forging ahead. Finally, after years of not moving fast enough. So yeah, there's actually a lot going on climate, and I think the job now is not to kind of wake people up out of complacency, because nobody's complacent in this environment. It's to harness that energy, you know, in inverted commas, that political energy productively, and use it to advance all these new energy projects. I absolutely agree with you. Look on the US. You know, US politics is volatile and often misguided. And the world, other countries outside the US have to have their own energy policies that move forward sensibly, regardless of what's going on in the US. We talk about the bond markets and their ability to punish errant governments, and we've seen a big part of this financial stress on governments is energy. These unaffordable commitments that have been made to subsidize energy, and whether you take the UK or the EU or developing countries in South Asia and elsewhere. But you know, solving the climate and energy challenges simultaneously is actually going to require huge additional government spending in new technologies, new infrastructure, and so on. So the question is, how do you finance that in a sensible way, and make sure that money is actually being spent in huge amounts, but in a productive way, and not just going to special interests or projects with excessively complex, long lead time projects that are not going to be effective on the time scales that we have.
Robin, I'm very happy to hear that you're less pessimistic than me. Robin Mills, CEO of Kamar Energy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
So if you want to subscribe to Robin's weekly energy newsletter, you can do that at thenationalnews.com. That's all we've got time for today. All that remains is to thank our production team and you all for being with us. Do join us again next time.